Fort Myers, Florida, the winter home of Thomas and Mina Edison, remembers Thomas Edison as its first citizen, benefactor, and friend. In February of every year, the Edison Pageant of Light, in tribute to his remarkable accomplishments, honors the memory of Thomas Alva Edison. The Edison Pageant of Light is proud to be a part of the Local Legacies program of the Library of Congress. Through the auspices of another hometown hero, Senator Connie Mack, the Edison Pageant is pleased to present this pictorial history of a locally legendary event. Mr. Edison discovered Fort Myers, Florida in 1885 and returned the following year with his bride, Mina Miller Edison, to build a winter home on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River. By 1887, Mr. Edison had built his first laboratory on his Fort Myers estate, imported a steam engine and dynamo, and gave Fort Myers pioneer citizens their first taste of incandescent light.
The legend is that Mr. Edison offered a light to Fort Myers with lights, and that the city turned them down due to the fact that they said it would mess up the cows where they wouldn't give milk or this, that, and the other. Scare them to death, I suppose.
The city fathers didn't like the idea because this was a small town in those days, and the only way they earned money was by raising cattle and shipping them to Cuba. And they were afraid electricity was going to blind the cattle and maybe stop them from reproducing or stop them from producing milk. And they didn't dare take a chance on that for fear it would stop the way the town was maintaining itself.
Mr. Edison referred to his visits to his Fort Myers retreat as working vacations, and from 1885 until his death in 1931, generally spent part of the year here in what he liked to call his adoptive home. Mr. Edison found our climate pleasant, and once told a reporter from the New York World, "The air here in Fort Myers is perfect, the weather is beautiful, and the days are a constant succession of blue skies and warm sunshine. And to all this, I owe a rapidly returned health." Late in life, Mr. Edison made a prediction that Lee Countyans, and especially pageant members, have come to believe is a prophecy come true.
There is only one Fort Myers, and 90 million people are going to find it out.
Edison, although deeply engaged in his work, took time off to visit with the young people of Fort Myers.
When I saw Mr. Edison, when I was about 6, 7, 8, or 9 years old, I was longer out there someplace, my uncle took me over to see him. And and I went through his lab, and he gave me a book that he autographed while I was there. And also he gave me a sample of rubber that he'd made out of goldenrod. He was working on that at the time. And that was very interesting to me. But like I said, he was a little hard for him to understand me. And I didn't realize what was going on at the time till later on. I realized he was pretty deaf. And then he had a birthday party down at the pier, and I can recall that he cut the cake, and all of us kids were out there having a big time, and he was carrying on and laughing, and so were we.
As the years passed, Mr. Edison's birthday party grew in importance. The celebration brought many famous people to Fort Myers who were privileged to claim friendship with the world's most famous wizard. Most notable among these guests were Henry Ford, who purchased property next door to the Edisons so that he and his great friend might enjoy working vacations together. Harvey Firestone was another frequent guest, and it was out of these birthday celebrations that the Edison Pageant of Light was born.
How did the pageant begin? Well, it took over from a celebration that had previously started in this town. Back in the late 1800s, this was a cowboy town, of course. The cowboys decided to have a celebration in which they would compete with each other. And so they worked out a celebration in which they picked a sandy lane and hung wooden circles from the trees, and the cowboys, riding on their horses with wooden lances, rode down the sandy lane trying to spear these wooden rings hanging from trees. And the cowboy that speared the most rings was entitled to pick the Queen of Love and Beauty. So that's what they did. Now, of course, the interesting thing about that is that the sandy lane where the cowboys rode this, is now called Tournament Street. A real estate promoter named Jimmy Crafton came to town. This was in 1928, and he staged a sun worshiper celebration. He did it as an event to draw attention to Fort Myers, which was a very small and unknown town in those days, and elected the first Sunshine King and Queen. The Sunshine Court couldn't last eventually because there were days when we had rain, and that messed up the tournament. So later on then, the Women's Community Club and the Junior Chamber of Commerce decided to restart the Sunshine Court, but they didn't want to make it the old Sunshine Court. They wanted to celebrate Thomas Alva Edison, and so they named it the Edison Pageant of Light and staged it that way. And so that was in 1938 that we started the Pageant of Light, and it's been very successful ever since.
After Mr. Edison's death in 1931, the people of Fort Myers held an annual memorial service to mark the anniversary of his birth. In 1938, Mr. Robert Halgrim, a personal friend of the great inventor and editor of the Fort Myers Press, suggested that a more elaborate tribute to the wizard take place annually.
Well, it started with Ronald Halgrim and a group of men who involved members of the then Junior Chamber of Commerce and the Women's Community Club. And the Women's Community Club, I believe, was organized in the beginning to entertain our winter visitors. They never affiliated with the Women's Federation or anything. They always wanted to do their own thing and just in Fort Myers for the winter people. And this was something that a group of the very creative thinkers thought that would stimulate interest and business in Fort Myers to have a pageant honoring our famous citizen, Thomas Edison.
The first Edison Pageant of Light was held February 10th, 11th, and 12th of 1938. The first Edison pageant featured activities that included a jalopy derby, a street carnival, a cracker band contest, the annual memorial service, and a 3-mile-long, 7-band, 50-float parade. In addition to these events, the pageant also featured the young men and women of the community in a royal pageant that culminated in the crowning of a king and queen of the mythical realm of Edisonia. This tradition has survived the test of time and is the cornerstone of today's Edison Pageant of Light.
The coronation ball, with music provided by Homer Mercer and his Tampa Orchestra, was held in the town club, which was resplendent with gilded royal palm fronds banked behind elegant thrones, which were placed on a raised dais. A formal portrait of Thomas Edison was highlighted by torcheries. Crowning the first royal Edisonia pair, King James E. Henry III and Queen Virginia Shepherd, was Fort Myers' man about town, Mr. Sidney Davis.
It was the most exciting thing that ever happened to me, I guess, other than the day I was married. But the pageant was something that we all enjoyed and liked when it was begun. And I went to the ball that night not dreaming that I'd ever be queen. And I was dating Sidney, who was Lord Chamberlain at the time. And while he and Sam Johnson, who was dating Virginia Holloway, who had been crowned the first queen, and I was the second, they had kidded and said it had cost them so much money to get people to vote for us. And that they hoped someday we'd both be queens, and that's the way the conversation went and the whole scenario went. And when they called my name that night, I nearly fainted. I couldn't believe that it was I and happening to me, and I thought, well, it's just the greatest thing in the world. And of course it came at a period in my life that everything was very carefree, and we were all happy and having good times and enjoying life.
In 1941, a baby parade was added to the list of community events featured in the 3-day festival. Catherine Miller, the 4th Queen of Edisonia, remembers that the Edison pageant was not strictly a social event. Her coronation took place at the municipal pier on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River.
I was crowned in February of 1941, and in December of 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. This interrupted our lives for the next 4 or 5 years until the war was over. Nobody felt like anything as superficial as a coronation or a queen of Edisonia. The whole thing just disintegrated because we were so intent on winning the war and doing our bit. As it turned out, my bit was to represent the community and any activities that they thought would draw a crowd to sell bonds or promote whatever was being promoted for the war effort. And of course, I was really glad to do this.
Victory in Europe and Japan set the celebratory mood as February 1946 marked the resumption of a revitalized, grander Edison Pageant of Light. Mrs. Thomas Edison, widow of the great inventor, was the honored guest of the pageant as it resumed for the first time since 1941. On February 9, 1946, the biggest crowd in its history thronged into Fort Myers for the Edison Pageant of Light parade.
The day was perfect with a temperature that reached 80 degrees by noon and made the holiday scene a perfect delight. It was grand to see the high-stepping bands, the glistening floats move through the flag-draped heart of Fort Myers.
As part of the Edison Centennial, 1847 to 1947, the Edison Pageant of Light expanded its festivities into a 9-day celebration, with events including speeches, a fireworks display, a royal dinner and dance hosted by the King and Queen, the Pro-Am Edison Golf Tournament, shuffleboard and tennis tournaments, a street dance, and a flower fashion show. 1947 also saw the debut of the Gopher Derby Sweepstakes. 3,000 spectators turned out to watch Florida gophers, a mild-mannered species of land tortoise, race for the finish line. Throughout the 1950s, Fort Myers continued to grow. In addition to being the gladiola capital of the world, cattle, citrus, fishing, and tourism combined to make Fort Myers a prosperous little town. Throughout the 1950s, Charles Edison and his family remained dedicated friends of the pageant and returned year after year to crown its kings and queens. In 1959, the usually solemn Edison Memorial Service was transformed into a birthday party celebration. A local restaurant baked the first Edison birthday cake. It was a 7-tier, 300-pound creation, served free to everyone attending by lovely local young ladies, forevermore dubbed Cakeettes. During the late 1950s, folding chairs began to crop up along the parade route in the days prior to the Grand Parade of Light, thus securing prime locations for their owners. Even today, people still respect the tradition, and early in February, thousands of chairs appear to line the streets along the parade route.
As Lord Chamberlain, my duty really was to be master of ceremonies, because this was an event held on a stage, and I would guide the king and queen and the dukes and duchesses and princesses and princes up on the stage to their chairs, and then I would go down and get the little boys who were pages and the little girls who were also in the event, and guide them up on the stage. And I would have to teach them how to bow, because they would have to bow when they got up on the stage. So they didn't know anything about bowing, so I would just teach them how to bow. Put one hand in front of your belt and one hand on your back, and then lean forward.
Charles Edison, at age 74, still loved to return to Fort Myers and the festival.
Charles Edison once said to me, "This pageant is wonderful. It's the only place in the world where my father is still remembered."
The decade of the 1970s arrived amidst all the glamour and glitz the pageant could muster. The Edison Pageant of Light's first national band show was established in 1972 as a part of the festival programming. The Gopher Derby continued to fascinate crowds, but the listing of gopher tortoises as a threatened species brought some changes to how entrants were procured.
Only the finest and thoroughbred double-jointed racing tortoises were used. They were rented from the Fraternity Texas Terrapin Ranch and received tender, loving care. They were fed select high-protein strawberries and drank only pure mineral spring water. The prestigious Gophers arrived in Fort Myers by jet aircraft in time for the annual Run for the Lettuce.
In 1975, the first annual Thomas Edison Great American Award was presented to Roy Rogers, the famous singing cowboy. The award was created to recognize outstanding achievement in a field that began with an Edison invention. During the 1980s, Red Skelton was also honored with this award, and the pageant played host to a wide variety of guests, from Maria von Trapp to George Brett. In 1987, Dr. Robert Arnold, then president of the pageant, announced that a county-wide Young Inventors competition, given a trial run the year before, would be expanded. Today, the Science and Inventors Fair still sparks the spirit of innovation and creativity in the minds of school children throughout Southwest Florida. The golden anniversary of the Edison pageant was celebrated in 1988. Queen Virginia Shepherd, the first queen of Edisonia, was presented to pageant members along with all the living former royalty at a glowing 50th anniversary King and Queen's Ball. 1989 brought great change to the Edison pageant. In December of 1988, the pageant directors announced plans to create a separate nonprofit organization called the Edison Festival of Light, which would oversee all the public events that were formerly sponsored by the pageant. The private social events, including the coronation and King and Queen's Ball, remained under the control of the Edison Pageant of Light. Despite this change, the pageant continued to be the major financial contributor to the newly created festival. With the Grand Parade of Light and other public events now conducted by the festival, the decade of the 1990s saw the pageant reach dazzling heights as it moved its events from the City Exhibition Hall to the state-of-the-art Harborside Convention Center. Today, the Edison Pageant and Edison Festival of Light coexist and are still guided by the inspiring example left by Thomas Alva Edison and his family. Over the years, growth and change have built on the solid foundation of our friendly small-town character. The story of the Edison Pageant of Light is the story of Fort Myers. From our roots in the dusty jousting contests on Tournament Street to the high-tech convention hall celebrations of today, the Edison Pageant of Light still reflects those qualities that make our town as appealing today as it was when Thomas Edison first came to us in 1885.
Chaos Productions Incorporated.